Good day to you. This sermon recap is for Proper 19B, the year of Mark, preached at University Lutheran on September 16th, the year 2012. Let me get in front of us the gospel for yesterday, for the Sunday. Mark chapter 8, we're still in the Gospel of Mark, 8:27 and following. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "Some say John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." Jesus asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and killed after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke Jesus. But Jesus, turning and looking at his disciples, rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Jesus called the crowds with his disciples and said to them, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their soul? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my generation and this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. I wanted to talk about Jesus' understatement in this piece of Mark. Now again, remember where we've been these last weeks in Mark. The feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000, the Syrophoenician woman, the Pharisees accusing Jesus and his disciples eating with unclean hands and so having an unclean heart and being unclean altogether. Jesus heals another blind man right before this piece and then goes to Caesarea Philippi with his disciples and then has this statement that I claim to be an understatement, a profound understatement. And so I wanted to begin with a classic understatement, and so I simply Googled classic understatement. And though I'm not familiar with, not a fan of the Jaws movies back in the day, the series, I asked if any were, and there were probably a handful, 4 or 5 hands that went up. And particularly one student who actually was my assisting minister yesterday, Kevin. And so here's what Google listed as one of the classic understatements. Quint, a local fisherman with experience in hunting shark, offers to hunt down the great white shark that is Jaws. Soon Quint and Brody are at sea in a little fishing boat, trying to draw the monster in by throwing chum off the bow. Suddenly, Jaws, the shark, lifts up his head completely up out of the water, and then disappears again within a flash. Brody quietly walks up to the helm, and in a classic understatement tells Quint, and I stop there and ask if anybody knew what the line is, and maybe you know the line, "You're going to need a bigger boat." This sense that in that understatement, the full impact of the overstatement, of the statement's fullness and truth and weight, then comes crashing home. Jesus says in a classic understatement that the Son of Man will suffer and be rejected, killed, and on the third day rise. And I just wanted to set this up to give us a sense that Jesus was speaking kind of this overwhelming, honest, simple truth. And here's how I did it. That when we hear Jesus say the Son of Man must suffer, sometimes we begin thinking doctrine, and sometimes we begin thinking theology and atonement and Anselm and Abelard and substitutionary atonement and all these kinds of things that we have come to decide on, agree with over the centuries of being in the church. But the word that Jesus uses can have a simpler meaning than that, and I think in Mark, simple is always probably where we're at. That the word that Jesus uses doesn't necessarily indicate intent. It's not as if Jesus is saying God makes it so, or God ordains it so, or God schemes it so. The word simply can mean it's inevitable. It's inevitable that the Son of Man will suffer, be rejected by the scribes and elders and Pharisees, suffer, die, and be raised. It's inevitable that these things will happen. So let's set this up. Jesus speaks this in Caesarea Philippi, in this place that was the center of the ancient false god Baal. It was the center of the Greek or god Pan, Pan. There was a Roman version of that. It was the place of worship of Caesar. He had his palace there in Caesarea Philippi, named after his son Philip. It was the center of the worship of, if there was any, the puppet king Herod was in this place. It was also kind of known as a place of social excess, pleasure excess, a vacationing place there by the sea. And so you have all of these things that are crowded into this space, and it's in this space, after Jesus having been rejected by the Pharisees, having fed the 5,000 and the 4,000, and healing two blind and mute, a mute fellow and a blind fellow, that Jesus then asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And in the midst of all this other worship in this place, it's inevitable that Jesus is going to run up against these folks, against the religious leaders, against the political leaders, against this time and place that is of social, a pressure cooker that's ready to burst its lid. Here is this one who begins to gain momentum in the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000, notoriety, popularity. There is this kind of building up in Mark, and Jesus, from this place, in the midst of all of this other bits and pieces jammed in this one place, Jesus says, who do you say that I am? Add to that the first answers to the question, and in fact, Peter's answer, that you're the Messiah. Some say Elijah, some say John the Baptist, some say one of the prophets. By the very fact that all of that language is being used and jumbled up and tossed around and then thrown on the back of Jesus' shoulder, it's inevitable that he's going to be rejected, suffer, and die. That this is also a pressure cooker time religiously in the place of Rome, that is, for the Jews, a foreign power on their shoulders. And so at least 600 years of the Jewish people longing for a Messiah, longing for one who will be like David. It's no wonder, it's inevitable. It's an understatement. It's inevitable that this one, who is called John the Baptist, who is called Elijah, the forerunner, the one who is called Messiah, it's inevitable by the very fact that those terms, those titles, those names are given to this one who is Jesus of Nazareth. It's inevitable that he will suffer and die. That being said, it's hard enough to hear that those things are going to happen to Jesus. Jesus also then says, by the way, they're also going to happen to you. Take up your cross, deny yourself, and follow me. In some sense, that's likewise an understatement. It's inevitable that we who belong to Jesus, as disciples of Jesus, followers of Jesus, are going to run smack dab up against all those same kind of things. That suffering is inevitable for us who stand with the Christ and against those things. It's also, suffering is inevitable in us, that there is this constant pressing within ourselves, this constant turning within ourselves to deny ourselves and to follow Jesus. And it's not a simple denying. It's not, one commentator said that it's not simply to say, don't eat chocolate, or don't smoke a cigarette, or abstain from sex, or some more moral kind of abstaining, as if that's denying ourselves. It's a bigger question than that. It's to say, Jesus is saying, and this gets brought to full force when he talks to the rich young ruler in Mark, you can't save yourself. Deny finally this knee-jerk need to be your own Messiah. Stop depending on yourself and wielding your own sense of needing to justify yourself and save yourself and make yourself righteous and right with others. And so when you deny yourself, then we have this energy to do something, anything, for the sake of neighbor, stranger, and enemy. That we deny ourselves, we deny this sense that we have to save ourselves, and we take up our cross and follow Jesus. And so there is this ever-growing, in this section of Mark, you get this business about being yeasted with new things. And there is this sense that there is this conversation in ourselves always going on, drip by drip by drip, drop by drop by drop, that we begin to deny ourselves, give up this need to save ourselves and follow Christ. Here's the last other thing that will cause us suffering, that at times we all know, each of us, that we do not deny ourselves and we do not pick up our cross, but in fact we deny the Christ and we offer him a cross. Mark uses the exact same word, and it's supposed to stop us. It's supposed to kind of give us a prick in our own conscience for Peter and for you and for me. That Mark uses the same word. Jesus says, deny yourself, take up your cross. It's the same word. In fact, it's a fairly drastic word, that Peter denies knowing Jesus. That it's a word as if to say that the other doesn't even exist. And so when Jesus says, deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me, instantly in the Gospel of Mark, we hear the exact same word used of Peter and of you and of me, that we deny Jesus, and in fact he takes up the cross in our stead. Which brings us back then to, again, the understatement that maybe this is also not only a statement about Caesar and Herod and the gods of Caesarea Philippi and the religious leaders and the pressure cooker that is Rome and Judaism of the time, but it really is then something about atonement. It really is something about Jesus taking up his cross on our behalf to suffer, die, and rise, that we should then finally have life, that no one can save us finally except the Christ. That's also an understatement, that when we finally get around to speaking as Peter speaks, that Jesus, you are our Messiah, that Jesus, you are Lord, as the woman, the Syrophoenician woman, has already spoken in the Gospel of Mark. Lord, give us a piece of bread, even a scrap of bread that falls from the children's table, that my daughter, that the world should be well. It's a drastic understatement to say that Jesus, you are Messiah. That there is some sense that in this confession we are confessing that we need a bigger boat. That Jesus, you are the way, the truth, and the life. That you are the one who is Messiah in a far bigger way than we could have ever hoped for, ever known ahead of time, as you then, Jesus, take up your cross and go to die and to be raised. That's the understatement for us, for you, for me, for Jesus, as he speaks this simple question, who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? That we get to speak a profoundly exaggerated understatement, that you are the Messiah. Grace and peace, be well in all things.